Thank you. It's good to see everyone here. Friends together, comrades, brothers and sisters in the struggle. So as Max already mentioned, we stand here together on the 68th anniversary of the Bandung Conference, when 29 newly independent governments from Africa and Asia came together in Bandung, Indonesia, to form an independent bloc against the global north, against the imperialist world. Bandung was a milestone, but it was not the end. After Bandung came the non-alignment movement, the Tricontinental Conference, the Organization of Solidarity with the People of Asia, Africa and Latin America, the new International Economic Order, and many other initiatives that aim for Global South unity against imperialism. It is a project that has been violently suppressed by Western invasions, assassinations, and coups against independent leaders such as Mohamed Mossadegh in Iran, Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, and Salvador Allende in Chile, and many, many others. The imperialist powers sought to maintain and deepen colonial relations, opening up the South for their multinational corporations, for cheap labor and resources. And unfortunately, they largely succeeded. According to UN figures, during colonialism, the gap between the richest and poorest countries in the world grew from 3-to-1 to 30-to-1. And in the neo-colonial era, this inequality grew to 180-to-1 in just a few decades. Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana's first independent leader and co-founder of the non-alignment movement, therefore called neo-colonialism, and I quote, the worst form of imperialism. And like so many others, Nkrumah was overthrown by the CIA shortly after making this statement. Yet the spirit of Bandung has not been broken. For the first time in nearly 50 years, another resolution for new international economic order was passed at the UN General Assembly this December, a detailed plan to stop the exploitation of the Global South. A decade earlier, in Cochabamba, Bolivia, movements from across the globe united in a declaration for the rights of Mother Earth and reparations for the climate colonialism of the Global North. And right now, as we speak, in southern Akyala, better known as South America, a new wave of anti-imperialist leaders have been elected and are deepening their ties against the Western imperialist world. And during our international panel tomorrow, we will hear much more about reparation initiatives coming from the Global South, particularly from Palestine, Venezuela, and Pan-Africanist struggles. So the struggle for the South continues. But what can we learn from that struggle right here in the Netherlands, in the Global North? What is our role to play? I think part of the answer can be found in the echoes of Bandung. In 1955, Indonesian President Sukarno opened the Bandung Conference with a tribute to its predecessor. And I quote, I recall in this connection the conference of the League Against Imperialism and Colonialism held in Brussels almost 30 years ago. At that conference, many of the esteemed delegates present here today met and found new strength in their struggle for independence, end quote. So in Brussels, in the heart of a colonial empire, it seems it is mixed up. In the heart of a colonial empire, important future anti-colonial leaders met each other for the first time, such as Mohamed Hatta from Indonesia, Masali Haj from Algeria, Josiah Tangana Gumede from South Africa, and Jawaharlal Nehru from India. But the League Against Imperialism was also funded by the Communist International, whose members were obligated to struggle against colonialism in word and deed as laid out in its founding documents. So the prehistory of Bandung is also a history of international solidarity, even here in the heart of empire. So we are here together to repair 500 years of historical and ongoing colonial damages. And within RLS and the Decolonial International Network, we believe that we can only succeed together in solidarity between different movements and different communities. So it heartens me to see all of you here together, people who are active in different communities and different movements, from the anti-racist struggle, to the climate movement, from the peace movement to the socialist movement. And as Max already mentioned in the speech, I will attempt to connect these struggles within the framework of decolonial reparations. So what can decolonization mean for our understanding of all these movements, and how can it offer a framework to connect all these movements? Those are the questions I will try to answer here today. So to begin, let me clarify what I mean by decolonization and what I think it means for the anti-racist movement. So decolonization is a word that is widely used today, actually only since a few years. You could even say it has become a bit of a buzzword now, but the concept is still rarely understood properly in its right context. It is a term that comes from the Global South to talk about global colonial power structures. But the term decolonization is often used in the West in a Eurocentric way, as a kind of historical interpretation of racism, an explanation of why we need more inclusion and diversity within our national borders for Dutch people with passport privilege. Inclusion and diversity is about more people of color within white organizations, including Shell, the military, and the police. Inclusion and diversity is not about fundamentally transforming an unjust world order built over 500 years of colonialism, not about questioning whether Shell, the military, and the police have a right to exist at all. But colonialism is much more than a historical interpretation of racism. It is an ongoing global phenomenon. It is about life and death. It means that someone in Yemen dies under Western bombs, that someone in Afghanistan starves to death because of Western sanctions, that someone in Pakistan is displaced by floods caused by the massive Western historical emissions that have colonized our atmosphere, and that the Amazon is being cut down to grow fodder for Dutch industrial agriculture. That people in an obscenely rich city like Amsterdam have to sleep on the streets in complete rightlessness because they supposedly don't have the right papers. Many of you will be familiar with the committee March 21st, which is named after the Sharpeville's massacre when apartheid police murdered 69 black protesters in March 21st, 1960. Less famous, however, is the more recent Marikana massacre in 2012, when 34 black South African striking miners were murdered by black police officers, all for the interests of a white British multinational company. Colonialism has always had its willing collaborators. Clearly then, decolonization is not about having more managers at Shell and more police officers of color. Decolonization is about the end of capitalism and imperialism, the end of hunger, poverty, murder, and ecocide on a global scale. Inclusivity and diversity is certainly an important step, a requirement for justice, but it is not the final destination. Decolonization is about repair and transformation, about the creation of a new world order. Over 1 in 5 Dutch people of color live in poverty. It is a shockingly high percentage for a country living in obscene wealth with more than 1 million millionaires. Yet it's worth emphasizing, if we extend that same poverty line to our brothers and sisters in the global south, more than 90% live in poverty there. According to a recent study, the Netherlands is one of the top 5 countries that benefit most from unequal trade with the global south. Since the 1960s, the Netherlands has robbed $4.4 trillion from the global south. That is more than 4 times our gross national product. So decolonization cannot possibly be only about oppression inside the Netherlands, it is about all oppression caused by the Netherlands, and that oppression extends far beyond our national borders. It is also crucial to realize that imperialism works like a boomerang. The racism we feel today is directly linked to 500 years of colonial exploitation abroad. And it is also linked to the imperialism we see that continues to this day. Is it a coincidence that we saw a huge rise in Islamophobia right after the start of the War on Terror, which according to Nafis Ahmed's conservative figures killed 6 million Muslims in Western Asia? Is it a coincidence that we saw a huge rise in anti-Asian racism in recent years, right at the moment when China was being declared by the West as its great geopolitical enemy? We already know that Western media effectively function as propaganda outlets in geopolitical conflicts, from books like Manufacturing Consent and the Dutch media monopoly. That same geopolitical propaganda, read day in and day out in the press, directly affects racist tendencies in the Netherlands. So the rise of Geert Wilders, Thierry Baudet, and Donald Trump are also about the wars of Jan-Peter Balkenende, Mark Rutte, George Bush, and Barack Obama. As anti-colonial writers have warned us for over a century now, fascism is a colonial boomerang. So clearly, decolonization has much to offer to the anti-racist movement. But decolonization and anti-racism also have much to offer for other movements, such as the peace movement, the climate movement, and the socialist movement. And I will briefly sketch these connections now, starting with the socialist movement. So today, more than 1 million Dutch people live in poverty. Half of the Dutch population in poverty has a migrant background, while they only represent a quarter of the Dutch population. Specifically, Dutch people of color are disproportionately pushed into poverty due to institutional racism in the labor market, the housing market, in education, in healthcare, throughout the criminal justice system, from the police to the courts. So anti-racism is crucial for any movement in the Netherlands that wants to claim to do anything for the working class here. Yet this is only the tip of the iceberg, because the majority of full-time workers working for the Dutch economy do not actually live inside the Netherlands at all. There are 14 million people working full-time in the Global South for extremely low wages, in dangerous working conditions, throughout the Dutch value chain, working for Dutch consumption, investments, or corporate profits. This is the neo-colonial reality today. The majority of people oppressed by Dutch capital do not live inside the Netherlands. They too must be part of our struggle. And third, anti-racism is also crucial to any socialist movement, whether in social housing or healthcare, because the neoliberal elites misuse racist sentiments as a lightning rod to deflect public anger as scapegoat politics. To cite just one example, since the 1990s, all subsidies for social housing have been removed, while the state loses billions of euros through the mortgage interest deduction, a typical Dutch thing here called hypotheekrenteaftrek, a subsidy effectively for homeowners. The fact that in Amsterdam there's now a waiting time for over 13 years within the social housing sector, instead of 3 years it took in the early 1980s, that has been structural governmental policy. Yet we see parties from the VVD to the PVV blaming asylum seekers for the few percentage points of social housing they take up each year. We can tell the same story about healthcare, about the social safety net. Everything gets demolished from the top down and people of color get blamed. So any socialist movement will have to pierce through their racist smokescreen to do something for the most oppressed in our society. But conversely, it is also true that the anti-racism struggle has much to gain from an alliance with socialists. I have already cited some of the early communist support for the anti-colonial struggle in the 20s and 30s, but it is also a fact that the decolonization struggle in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s was supported by socialist countries such as the Soviet Union, China, and especially Cuba. That the civil rights movement in the US had its roots within communist and socialist movements. Let us not forget that many popular anti-racist parties and leaders, such as the Black Panther Party in the US or Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, were explicitly communist. Even in the Netherlands, only the Communist Party of the Netherlands and the Communist Trade Union opposed the colonial invasion of Indonesia after World War II. Imperialism and capitalism have always been deeply intertwined, and resistance to one always requires resistance against the other. Which brings me to the peace movement. So when I say war, most people here probably, or I hope not here, but at least in the Netherlands, immediately think of Ukraine. I myself think first of the 400,000 victims in Yemen, most of them children, killed with Western weapons since 2015. Racism has caused some victims to be seen as worthy, others as unworthy. Tabe Bergman's PhD research on the Dutch press shows that Iraqi civilian deaths were a complete non-issue for major Dutch newspapers during the invasion of Iraq, despite the fact that our best estimates come to 1 million killed. How differently is the war in Ukraine portrayed? And how differently are Ukrainian refugees received here? After thousands of refugees from Africa and Asia drowned in the Mediterranean, suddenly there was room for Ukrainians. Many Western journalists literally stated that they would be, quote, more like us, or were, quote, civilized and European. And to this day, refugees of color are kept out, sentenced to death in the Sahara or the Mediterranean, or put in camps and pushed into complete rightlessness. Yet it is also striking how racism mutates when it serves the interests of our states. Just a short time ago, we had the Poland hotline, the Polenmeldpunt, and Eastern Europeans were being scolded with racist remarks. Now suddenly they are supposed to be the European frontier of civilization against the so-called Asian Russia, which the Wall Street Journal even compared to the Mongol horde. The typical Orientalist frames of a dictator gone mad who cannot be talked about directly undermine our chances for peace talks. Peace talks that even Ukrainian President Zelensky said himself he wanted to hold, and that seemed very promising shortly after the start of the war in April 1 year ago, but talks that were blocked by the West, as we know from high-level sources within Ukraine itself, within the United States, and within Russia. This endless war has an enormous impact, not only for Ukraine, but also for the global South and the poorest people inside Europe, who suffer from the rising food and energy prices. Today, nearly 1 billion people across the globe today go to bed hungry. This is precisely why the global South refuses to take sides in this war and pushes for negotiations in the spirit of non-alignment, in the spirit of Bandung. The West has much to learn from the South in this regard. And that energy and food crisis finally brings me to finish off to the climate movement. I believe most people here by now know that the richest countries polluted by far the most, and that the impacts come on the global South who polluted by far the least. This is commonly called climate racism. What most people don't know is how extreme these numbers really are. According to a recent study in The Lancet, 92% of the climate catastrophe has been caused by the global North. In fact, they should have reached not zero emissions by 2050, or even, as the more radical claims by climate parties, by 2030, but literally they should have been having had zero emissions decades ago. If you were to convert the global North enormous surplus of CO2 emissions into the costs of an accelerated green transition in the global South, we are talking about trillions of dollars. Set against the paltry climate finance being paid right now, it will take 4,000 years to pay those colonial debts. I repeat, 4,000 years. That's how extreme the colonization of the atmosphere really is. And obviously we do not have 4,000 years. But decolonization is not only necessary for an accelerated green transition in the South, it is also crucial for a green transition in the North. The majority of the excessive consumption of resources in the global North are extracted directly from the global South. That looting and plundering is so great that from it we could build the infrastructure for basic housing, healthcare, and education for 6.5 billion people. That is, without even mentioning the outsourcing of polluting industries, placing Western factories in China or Vietnam to pay low wages. Based on consumption figures, Dutch emissions have not dropped at all since 1990. They have increased by as much as 12%. That is the real, non-existent, colonial climate policy of the Netherlands. In other words, when we talk about reducing resource consumption and emissions in the context of the Netherlands, we are in fact talking about decolonizing our exploitation of the rest of the world. After all, where do all these raw materials come from? This imperialist plunder is accompanied by wars that in turn produce enormous emissions. The military climate footprint is about 6% of global emissions, comparable to 2 entire continents combined, Africa and Southern Abkhazia. This arms race is driven by NATO countries, which together spent about 17 times more on the military than Russia's alliance, the CSTO. And that militarism also colonizes our priorities. The richest countries spend 30 times more on the military than on climate finance for the global South. Prominent media report more on Russia in 1 month than the climate catastrophe was covered in an entire year. And our military is not preparing for a successful green transition, but for a dystopian world of resource wars and increased refugee flows, which they intend to crush. In this way, the climate challenge is fundamentally linked to neocolonialism, to racism, and to imperialist warfare, but also to capitalism. To stop depending on imperialist plunder, our society will have to change fundamentally. No longer shaped around the endless growth of corporate profits, but based on the core needs of our planet, people and planet. Healthcare, education, housing, community, and reciprocity. Policy will have to be shaped around the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is not only about political rights, but also actually about basic cultural, social, and economic rights. about the right to a dignified existence. And so we bring it full circle from socialism, anti-racism, anti-militarism to the struggle to protect Mother Earth. All these struggles are essentially a struggle for decolonization. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. I think investigative journalism with finding all these figures and data to connect these struggles is done very well.